This is a relatively quick little video to describe what I call Classon Theory. The whole point of Classon Theory is basically to describe the limits of human knowledge, what we can know, what we can't know, and generally how to think about the way that reality is organized. A lot of the terminology that I'm going to be using here was stolen from computer programming. And so I call these two things right here, mathematics and consciousness, I call them classons. A classon is basically like a holon, except it's a class of things. So let's actually start down here with what are called holons. Holons are, it could be almost anything, but they have two interesting properties. They're both a whole thing, and they're also part of something larger. So here's a common one. You have quarks, which are part of subatomic particles. Subatomic particles are part of atoms. Atoms are part of molecules. Molecules can make up macromolecules, and you can go all the way, you can follow this chain all the way to organisms and ecosystems and etc. The thing about quarks is they're a whole thing, and they have particular rules that govern how they operate, but they're also a part of subatomic particles. Quarks make up electrons, protons, and neutrons, and so the level of subatomic particles includes and transcends quarks. Same thing with atoms. Atoms are a whole thing, but they're part of, or they're comprised of subatomic particles rather. Those subatomic particles have laws and rules for how they operate, let's say. And atoms include and transcend the operating principles for subatomic particles. Okay, so the mathematics classon is a discrete thing. This is basically the stuff of the universe. This is physics, this is math, this is chemistry, this is biology, in their pure form. So over here you have the territory, basically. Consciousness, which we'll talk about later, is where the maps go. So this is basically all the stuff of the universe. You can think about this as kind of the, what's a good way to put it? It's basically what things can be made up of and how they work in the most pure sense. So things like objectivity, probability, object permanence, and again, all the stuff lives over here. This stuff, quarks and subatomic particles and atoms, and yeah. Now, what happens is consciousness is completely separate from mathematics. In a sense, consciousness is a completely different thing. None of this would matter. None of the stuff of the universe. It wouldn't matter if there was a universe, if there was no consciousness to experience it. We could imagine this universe that we're in right now. All of this stuff would still be there. It would still exist exactly as it does, but there would be nothing to experience it. Okay? So consciousness is the thing that experiences. It is feeling, qualia, subjectivity, perception, abstraction, and language. Consciousness is made up of qualons. This is qualia plus on. Anyway, we'll get back to that. You can see that there's an arrow here going from mathematics to consciousness. So this is why I was saying before that consciousness is the thing that experiences all the stuff. But it's different. It cannot just simply be reduced to all the stuff. Consciousness doesn't exist over here. It's its own separate class. And this is something that I stole from programming language, because classes are sort of discrete sets of objects that you can't really mix. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming languages, there's all kinds of things that are in let's say the integer primitive type, and if you try to do something in the string class with the integer primitive type, it doesn't work. And so that's basically what we see here. So consciousness is subjective. It's about perception. It's about abstraction. It's about language. It's about how it feels to be me right here, right now. And some of the qualons are, this is not an exhaustive list, but you have things like identity, intensity, valence, duration, location, and binding. And I can explain these more in another video. This is really just meant to be an overview. But The important one is identity. Okay, consciousness is subjective. So, for example, we could think of pi that exists over here in pure math. Um, I have my own perception of pi that's probably somewhat different from your perception of pi. Now, pi is a real thing that really exists. It's not just in our heads, but our heads can never actually fully comprehend what pi is, almost by definition. No one can have every digit of pi in their head by definition because it's an irrational number. So we can think about pi, we can talk about pi, we can even do really cool things with pi in math, also with building stuff and so on. It's a tool that we can use without necessarily fully understanding it. We're never going to have a full and complete objective understanding of the things that exist over here. Okay, once again, this is the actual territory. This is where we make maps of the territory. This might sound simple and obvious, but the map is not the territory. Okay? It's just a model of the territory, and it is necessarily incomplete, and in some ways you could say it's wrong. However, the value of a map is in how useful is it in terms of doing what you want to do. And very often what we use maps for is getting from one place to another. And so this is basically how the scientific method works. But the scientific method isn't telling us the true objective facts about what's over here. It's creating models inside of consciousness that are subjective and that are based on perceptions and abstractions. Okay? And the thing about consciousness is that it requires an identity. Okay? You cannot have an understanding of any of the stuff that's over here without an identity. Who's doing the understanding? This is very important. Now, you can see that the mathematics Classon goes up to this thing that I'm going to call the runtime, and this is also another term that I stole from programming. And then you can see there's arrows going from consciousness to the runtime and from the runtime to consciousness. And we'll talk about this later. But basically what the runtime does is it takes, let's say, the probability, right? We know about probability in terms of flipping a coin. We know about the collapse of the wave function, right? That subatomic particles are probability distributions until consciousness observes them, and then it becomes a real thing. Well, what I'm calling the runtime is the instantiation engine for reality. So it takes all of the stuff of the universe and consciousness and turns it into a lived experience in this particular moment. So a consciousness picks up a coin, which is a thing over here, flips it in the air. The runtime is the thing that determines whether it's heads or tails. That's the best way that I can describe it. We can't actually talk about what this thing is without essentially ending up with some kind of nonsense. And human beings have spent most of our history, we spent a lot of time trying to talk about what this thing is. And you might call it the theory of forms, you might call it God, you might call it the simulation, you might call it the matrix, right? Whatever it is, it's a thing that we cannot, even more so than this stuff over here, we cannot understand what this thing is doing. This is a hard limit of human knowledge. However, there is a feedback loop here where if you pay attention over enough iterations, you can start to get some kind of sense for whatever this thing is. Okay, famously, mystics think that you might be able to influence this thing with things like prayer and meditation and visualization and breathing exercises and so on. And I think that there is a little something to that. At a minimum, we can change how our consciousness interacts with or understands this thing on some level. And the better understanding that we have of what this thing is doing, or perhaps more accurately, what this thing is not doing, the better that we can sort of navigate this thing that we all call reality. But all of this is to say that there's a hard limit here where people think that they understand this stuff objectively. You cannot, do not we'll never be able to understand what's over here objectively. The best we can do is build subjective models and maps based on our perception, based on abstraction, and fundamentally using language, which is what I'm doing right now. What I'm doing right now is actually kind of absurd on some level under this framework. But I also think that it's a helpful model for looking at things. And then this is where people put God and mysticism and metaphysics and so on. And we like to tell ourselves stories about what this thing is doing, and some of them might be useful and some of them might not. But really, no one knows what this thing is, what it's doing, why it exists, none of that stuff. Um, we like to tell stories about it because that's what humans do. Anyway, this is the first of my explanations of Classon Theory. Let me know if you like it. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments or over on X. Like and subscribe because, it helps in the algorithm. This is basically how these videos are going to go. It's all going to be one take off the top of my head and basically no editing. So if you like this sort of thing, I'd like to see you around.